Hi, how well can you hear us?
We can hear you.
You can hear us. Okay, great. So I just want to apologize ahead of time for the technical difficulties. The laptop we usually use has completely failed. Where did it end up? Just be sure to put it back in the bag when it's working. It is. Okay, great. Yeah, because the only thing I want to say about that is it's been extremely intermittent. So we've rebooted it probably half a dozen times. And yes, so the order is in, is the good news. Unfortunately, it did not wake up in time. Also, the second problem is because we are using my personal laptop, I do not have the drivers loaded to work with our normal sound system. So that means that everybody is going to need to be even more quiet in order to in order to ensure that you're hearing what our are saying. And I would encourage everyone to move up as close as possible and then bring your chairs in as close as possible because that will increase the likelihood that you can. I will get my stuff in that way. All right. Here's all the way up the volume. It will be in just a second. Yeah, definitely. Okay, and then my last question is for our delightful guests before I turn things over to our amazing host, Leah. Laura, do you need to be a co-host as well in order to share the slides today?
I'm not sure. I think I just shared them. Let me try again and see if that works and you can see them.
Yes. All right, you are in good shape.
Excellent news.
Okay. All right, so that's as loud as it's going to get, my friends. So don't be afraid to bring the chairs forward.
Okay, and as mentioned, I am Leah Cartwright, going back to the Cartwright, my birth name. Today we have our special guests. We have Mayuri, sorry, I put my notes down and I didn't memorize your name. Mayuri Anupindi, the Global Advocacy Strategist at UUSC, and Laura Randall, also from UUSC. I am not going to do any further introductions because we are 12 minutes late. So if you would like to kick off your presentation, we are talking about the work of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee with climate refugees. A perfect topic for Nevada, given that we just experienced our first freezing temperature in November instead of October, which is very unusual. So welcome to Climate Change, everyone, and thank you for being here to our guests.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity and for taking time out of your day to hear us on this really important issue. I have great affection for the Reno, Nevada congregation. So as Michelle said, my name is Mayuri Anupindi. I'm the new Global Advocacy Strategist at UUSC. But a few years ago, I was serving as the Senior Partnership Officer for Migrant Justice and Crisis Response. And so had some chance to spend some time with some of your congregation on stewardship circle trips to Mexico and to other places. So really glad to see some familiar faces on the Zoom and to connect with you all again. So just while we get the presentation up and running, I'm not going to go into too much detail about who UUSC is today. Essentially, we're an 84-year-old human rights organization, and our three portfolios are climate and disaster justice, justice and accountability, and migration justice. And we work with human rights defenders around the world who are confronting oppressive structures. And we really believe that communities can lead the solutions to their own problems. So we really try and accompany partners, walk alongside them, and lift them up in global advocacy. So our work on climate forced displacement, we've been working on this issue for a number of years. And our refrain has always been that people think of this as an issue that's sometime in the future, that it's going to happen 20 to 30 years from now, but it really is happening now. And it's happening now, not only globally, but also here in the United States. So if we could just move to the next slide. So yeah, this is a few images from some of our partners around the world. And so climate change, it's posing really grave dangers to communities around the world, including the world's most vulnerable populations. So we've always had a big focus on Indigenous communities that we see as having, suffering some of the greatest impacts of climate change. And climate displacement, it can happen, in a number of different ways. The canonical example that we think about when we think about this is the disappearance of small island states in the Pacific. So states like Tuvalu, that whose land is slowly sinking into the sea. But that isn't really the only way it happens. It also happens through intensifying natural disasters. It also happens through the impact of a warming climate on agriculture and on food insecurity and water insecurity that can interact with other drivers of migration to different countries. And here I just wanted to share a note as well about why we talk about, climate migration or displacement rather than climate refugees. And that's really because, sorry, just pulling up my screen here. Yeah, and that's really because for a few different reasons. So first of all, the 1951 Refugee Convention has a really narrow and specific definition of climate change, of a refugee, which is someone that is fleeing persecution based on their race, sex, or other immutable qualities, and they have to have crossed an international border. Whereas people moving because of climate change, most of that displacement is already and will continue to be internal to a country's borders. So we really expect the majority of climate force displacement to be internal. And also because we found that sometimes, when you talk about refugees and non-refugees, it can be really exclusive and exclude a lot of people that are fleeing because of mixed motives from protection. And we really want to ensure that everyone has the right to migrate with dignity. So that's why we talk a little bit more about displacement rather than refugees. So if we could go to the next slide. So our approach. So at UUSC, we believe that communities who are most impacted by an issue have the solutions and ability to advocate for themselves. We accompany them providing grants, research, strategic communications, and advocacy support to help them achieve their goals. And so on climate, we are partnering with communities in the US, in the Pacific, in Haiti and the Caribbean, and in Mesoamerica, who are experiencing the worst impacts of climate change and advocating for a rights-based response. We also work on the global level, supporting our partners to attend the annual Conference of Parties on the Framework Convention of Climate Change. This year it will be in Baku, Azerbaijan. And we convene our partners to share experiences across geographies and advocate for community-based solutions together. So I wanted to share a few examples from our work. If we just go to the next slide. So this is just to kind of group our work a little bit. We advocate a lot for community and rights-based relocation in the Pacific and in the US. So I wanted to share a video, which is on the next slide. I'm not sure if it will work, but let's give it a try. On the Jean Charles Choctaw Nation's experience of climate displacement.
Parish, 80 miles southwest of New Orleans. Deep in southern Louisiana's marshlands, this isle, and the whole region, faces the harsh realities of climate change and its existential threats. For generations, the Jean Charles Choctaw Nation, also known as the Ile de Jean Charles Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw Tribe, has called Ile de Jean Charles home, making tribal sovereignty, self-sufficiency, and community safety their core values. However, relentless coastal erosion accelerated by climate change has significantly reduced the island's size, endangering the community's way of life. Since 1955, the isle's landmass has been reduced by 98%. Once more than 22,000 acres, the isle is currently a little over 300 acres. After years of challenges in accessing funds for their resettlement vision, the tribe found an opportunity for federal funding in 2016 through a U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development grant. the first of its kind. Because the tribe is not federally recognized, tribal leaders cannot apply directly for the grant. Instead, they partner with the state of Louisiana. HUD awarded the state of Louisiana $48 million for a tribal land resettlement of the Jean Charles Choctaw Nation, whose members are considered one of the first communities displaced by climate change in the country. They were promised a collaborative new initiative that would incorporate their input and respect their wishes. However, the Jean Charles Choctaw Nation alleges that Louisiana's Office of Community Development, tasked with executing the project, sidelined the tribe and minimized the wishes of its members, shifting the project's focus and causing significant delays and construction issues. Members of the nation were sloppily relocated to homes that are still vulnerable to climate change impacts. Private developers are turning Ile de Jean Charles into a sportsman's paradise rooted in profit and recreation that the state is facilitating by investing in island infrastructure, despite telling tribal leaders that it would no longer do so. On December 21st, 2023, the nation filed a Title VI civil rights complaint against the state of Louisiana, accusing the OCD of racial and ethnic discrimination. The complaint highlights their exclusion from decision-making and the resulting substandard and poor living conditions in the new settlement. Despite the nation's significant contributions to the initial planning and grant application, they claim that once federal funding was secured, the state redefined the project scope and removed the tribe as a project beneficiary. The nation demands preservation of their cultural identity, community cohesion, and their right to self-determination. The resettlement's execution, they argue, has compromised these essential aspects of their human rights. The nation demands recognition of its rights, respect for its collective vision, and a return to the original plan, one that embodies their needs and respects their sovereignty. Stay tuned for regular updates from UUSC and our partner, Earth Rights International, as we work collaboratively to address the legitimate concerns that arise with the federal government in the Title VI complaint. Visit uusc.org/JCCN as we support members of the nation and the world.
So UUSC has been accompanying this community, the Jean Charles Choctaw Nation, and has also worked in accompanying communities both in Louisiana, but also in Alaska. And we formed a legal justice coalition to explore some of the different legal strategies to achieve their goals. So in 2023, the Legal Justice Coalition invited the Special Rapporteur for Economic, Social, Cultural, and Environmental Rights from the Inter-American Commission to visit their communities and produce a report. And that was a really impactful visit. So on the next slide, we have an image from the Nunapitchuk community of Alaska.
Getting it back.
So yeah, he says right now in Nunapitchuk, there is water everywhere. Our homes are surrounded by pools of water. Our land is falling into the water. We're living in an Alaskan quicksand. Nowhere in our village is safe. We are seeing firsthand the effects of climate change on our community and on our lives. The Special Rapporteur ended up producing a really impactful report with 12 key recommendations for the US government. Go to the next slide. One of the chiefs said, "We are very thankful for the opportunity to share our truth with the Special Rapporteur and the world. It breaks my heart that even in today's time, this is the truth that we are amplifying." And the Special Rapporteur, he pointed to the interconnectedness of vulnerability to climate change and climate forced displacement and colonialism. He said, "The impacts of climate change occur within a web of historical and contemporary oppressions, diverse political and legal statuses, and limited economic resources. Indigenous vulnerability and resilience to climate change cannot be detached from the context of colonialism, which created both the economic conditions for climate change and the social conditions that limit Indigenous resistance and resilience capacity." So if we go to the next slide. A common thread that we see not only in the US, but also in the Pacific is that government responses to climate forced displacement often ignore the voices of those who are most impacted, and this has terrible results. So in 2023, UUSC supported the second annual Pacific Rising convening in Fiji. And during this 3-day event, activist groups from countries around the Pacific gathered to discuss their experiences confronting the climate crisis and had the opportunity to visit 3 different Fijian communities that were confronting climate change. One community that was visited was the Tukuraki village, which is home to 10 families who were forced to evacuate from their homes in 2012 due to numerous climate-related events, including a cyclone and a landslide. So that's pictured on the left there. And at first, the residents found shelter in a nearby cave, and then they moved to temporary housing for 5 years until settling in their current location. However, present-day elders say that one of the major gaps in mainstream crisis response is that it was completely planned and developed by the Fijian government with support from the European Union without the input of residents. So housing is pretty basic. It lacks many of the features that they need for daily living. And we have a video where one of the village elders explains the issue that they're facing. I'm not sure if the sound's coming through. But yeah, essentially what she says is, she says,
Enough to decide anything. Everything has been done by government. And see the planning of the houses. When it's hurricane, oh my God. That is what I told the government. Better for us to go back to the old site and live in that cave. Because how they do the planning, eh? Yeah. When it's hurricane, we can feel the house shaking like this. And we got small kids. So that is our evacuation center, that hall. And that hall too, it's not safe. Because we are living in a landslide place, eh? When we sleep over there, we should think sometimes that swim will come down. That is how they do the this is the same problem in Tomolo. Yeah, the government just go like this, but the villages finish.
yeah, so we've really seen this common thread of, botched relocation responses that ignore the wishes of communities. And so really advocate in all of our, domestic and global advocacy for community-led relocation approaches. Just go to the next slide. Yeah, so essentially, we say that frontline communities should be resourced to lead their own disaster risk assessment and relocation planning, and that communities should be supported to adapt where that's possible. But when they determine that relocation is necessary, they should lead that process as well. So here we have an image of Chantel Comardel from the Jean Charles Choctaw Nation. And, one thing that the video didn't discuss, but really struck me when she was speaking about her experiences was that they had gone through this extensive process where they had gotten designers and architects involved, an extensive community consultation process, and had really designed a solution that included things like a community hall where they could gather, that had ways for them to, continue fishing. All of these factors were considered and had been thoughtfully planned over many years. And then when the Louisiana state government came in, all of that was ignored, and they essentially were assigned a site of 35 some houses to live in that were inadequate and were not able to, that was still climate vulnerable. So she is very passionate, and she shares her experiences with other communities that might be facing this same issue. Go to the next slide. Yes, so another aspect of our work is defending land and community from climate impacts in Mesoamerica. And here we work with communities in Guatemala, Honduras, and Mexico, looking at issues that, looking at strengthening environmental defenders who are defending their land against corporate interests, and also helping sustain communities that want to stay on their land rather than migrate. So if we go to the next slide. In Guatemala, indigenous rural Maya communities have some of the highest rates of migration to the US, Mexico, and Canada. And subsistence farming, which is impacted by climate change, is no longer sufficient for many. And the lack of other economic opportunities drives people to move. So we've been supporting Asociación Popno, which works with families and communities across northern Guatemala, helping them start home gardens and providing materials and long-term support from local agronomists. And a core part of Popno's land and territory defense project is the recovery of indigenous agricultural practices which better care for the land and are based on indigenous communities' relationships with the earth. If we go to the next slide. In Nicaragua, Fundación Entre Mujeres, or FEM, organizes women in rural northern communities to be sustainable producers on their own land and uses a feminist lens that recognizes the damage done to the earth by the current systems. And the ability to stay and produce enough is constantly being threatened by ever more unpredictable weather. So what FEM did was set up a school called the Madre Tierra School for Ecotechnology, which is a space for young women from surrounding communities to learn sustainable and climate adaptive agroecological practices with a feminist approach. So they also emphasize an intergenerational approach, which recognizes young people's connection to the land and their communities. Another example we wanted to raise, if we go 2 slides ahead, is Fundación Sans Alonso Rodriguez, or FSAR, which, like Popno and FEM, provides community education on farming and agroecology to encourage healthy relationships with the land and with food. So here we have a few pictures of FSAR staff of demonstrating principles of building on local soil, as well as showing the agroecology pyramid. They have a sustainable construction lab which prioritizes building with local materials and traditional techniques, making homes that are harmonious with the local environment and earthquake resistant and able to adapt to warmer and wetter weather. But what we tragically found with the case of a lot of environmental defenders is that because they are, in opposition to many powerful corporate interests, their lives are often at risk, and they're often targeted by government and corporate forces. So our dear friend, Juan Lopez, if we just go to the next slide, we have his image. He was assassinated on September 14th. As he left his church with his family in Tocoa, Honduras. And he was a tireless defender of land and the rule of law. And he had been incarcerated with Guapanol 8, who were defending water against local interests. And he'd been warning since 2022 that he was being targeted. Another case of this kind of targeting was that of Berta Caceres, who was an indigenous activist and land defender who was murdered for her work in 2016. So we just go to the next slide. By recuperating and facilitating indigenous ways of being with the earth and monitoring the impacts of climate change and defending community land from those that would destroy it, we're helping protect the biodiversity and resilience of the land to climate change. And they're also our partners are models of how we can reflect on our relationships with land and the environment around us. And demand accountability from powerful structures that threaten our common home. So finally, I just wanted to touch on some of the global advocacy that we're doing on climate. So the global sort of advocacy space on climate can become very complex. I sometimes think that that's deliberately so. So we have the UN framework on climate change that has the annual conference of parties that I mentioned. This one is going to be in Azerbaijan. And what we try and do is bring the voices of directly impacted communities to these events where, often negotiations can become quite abstract and overly complex. So last year at the Conference of Parties, we supported a side event panel that brought together our partners from across the world who were talking about the need for more funding for communities impacted by climate change. If we just go to the next slide. So the Framework Convention, it contains multiple pillars. So the first pillar is mitigation. So that's, reducing emissions that cause climate change. The second is adaptation, which is the need to adapt to climate impacts that are already happening and will continue to happen. So on the mobility front, that can involve supporting people to move as a form of adaptation to climate change, but it can also be supporting communities to stay in the lands that they have known and loved for so many years, and adapt to climate change. But this was really insufficient. People experiencing the worst of climate change for a long time were advocating for some form of reparations from the global north. So, in recognition of the fact of the people who were experiencing the worst impacts were not the ones who had contributed the most to climate change, some form of reparation or compensation. This got a lot of resistance from the global north. It continues to be, toxic terminology in the US Congress, but it ended up taking up the form of loss and damage. So in COP27, so that was 2 years ago, there was a fund for loss and damage that was created to compensate communities for what they're losing due to climate change. And this can be both economic loss, which is things like homes, income, and non-economic loss. So things like your spiritual connection to the land, your identity as a people, if that's rooted in land, sovereignty. So, and the right to move with dignity is a big part of loss and damage. So UUSC is supporting two international coalitions. One is the Loss and Damage Collaborative, and the other is the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, who are advocating for adequate funding for this loss and damage fund. And for that funding to be not just not loan-based, but grant-based. So one of my colleagues at Climate Week said something very memorable, which is that you can't burn someone's house down and then offer them a loan to help rebuild it. That's just corruption. So it really needs to be highly concessional loans or like grant-based funding. The assessed needs for the loss and damage fund run into the billions, but at the last year's Conference of Parties, the US pledged only $17.1 million for the fund, which is really a paltry amount. And I don't believe it's been paid as yet. So our partners are really advocating for that loss and damage fund to become operational in 2025 to start dispersing money and for greater funding and pledges from different governments. And then finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about the International Court of Justice advisory opinion, which is coming up. So I talked about in the beginning, the canonical example of climate force displacement is the disappearance of small island states in the Pacific. Well, Pacific youth have been fighting this outcome with everything they've got. And one really inspiring partner we have is the Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change. If we can just go to the next slide. So they were law students at the University of South Pacific, and they were asked by the professor, how could we use international law to fight climate change? And they had this idea of asking for an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, which is the UN's highest court. And they not only had this idea, in a university setting, but they actually implemented it. So they formed an organization and they campaigned across the Pacific first, and then in New York at the General Assembly to make this happen. So the UN General Assembly ended up asking for, unanimously, they asked for an advisory opinion from the court. And there've been written submissions this year. It's the largest case in the court's history with the number of written submissions. And over 100 states and international organizations will be presenting oral arguments in The Hague at the International Court of Justice in December this year. So we'll be on the ground with our partners, the Pacific Island Students, and they're really aiming to ensure that voices of impacted communities, again, are present at the court when the eyes of the global media will be on this issue. And while the advisory opinion doesn't specifically, like the request for an advisory opinion doesn't specifically mention climate displacement or migration, we're hopeful that the court will address it in their opinion. And even if they do not, there's also a similar request before the Inter-American Court on Human Rights, which specifically says, can you please tell us what the obligations of countries are in response to climate displacement? So we'll be tracking both of these proceedings very closely. And if we could just move to our last slide. So opportunities to act. I think the first one, and I really sympathize with everyone in Nevada. I'm sure you're getting many more text messages and calls than me in New York, but the first is to vote. On Tuesday, because I think the whichever party gets in is really going to influence the trajectory of this issue in the United States and globally. And then the second is to support UUSC or follow our socials for opportunities to act. There are two partner asks that I wanted to lift up here. One is the Pacific Island students petition on the ICJ advisory opinion. This is just a chance to show global support for a really strong progressive opinion on climate change. And then the second is a petition on demands for the current conference of parties that I mentioned in Azerbaijan. So the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition have a list of demands that you can sign up to as well at the link. And I'll send this to the organizers to make sure that you all get this via email as well. But yeah, that concludes my presentation. And if you have any questions, I would love to hear them.
Thank you. Thank you for that presentation. I know it was a little bit quiet here in the room. Hopefully everyone was able to hear. Do we have questions here in the room or online? I'll watch the chat there, but Mayuri, I have a question. This is Leah. I can stick my face here. Hello.
Hello.
I had to step out to take my 3-year-old to the restroom, and I may have missed something, but what are the responsibilities of countries to climate displaced individuals? For example, here in Nevada, we do have very warm summers now, but I do think there's an opportunity to accept climate migrants here. Is there any kind of formal recognition or responsibility of different countries and states to accept climate displaced persons?
So this is like a really vast evolving issue. So I think, under say like the Refugee Convention, the 1951 Refugee Convention, there isn't really the obligation to accept people fleeing solely due to climate change. But the thing is, because usually people's motives for leaving are mixed and these things are intertwined, we do have cases where people might be, for example, being discriminated on the grounds of their race, but also experiencing climate change impacts, and then would have the right to kind of access refugee status or asylum in another country. And then the picture gets a little bit more complicated with there's a regional declaration called the Cartagena Declaration, which has a different definition of a refugee, which is much more expansive. So it includes, people fleeing wars, people fleeing events that really disrupt the public order. So there are also efforts to kind of expand that declaration to encompass people fleeing like the impacts of climate change. But more than that, I think that there are, various like rights-based and principle-based responses where, yes, countries should be accepting climate migrants. I mean, there's an evolving debate about whether that is like the right to migrate as a form of reparation. Like, for example, people leaving Haiti, where, they might be experiencing the impacts of climate crisis in addition to all these other crises. And Haitians have contributed some of the least to climate change, so the right to migrate as part of that reparation. So this is a really fast evolving area. There's been also some human rights cases at the UN where the Human Rights Committee found that a country could not send a person back that had been where he would not be safe in his home country, partly due to climate change. So there are these kind of chips at the legal framework to strengthen that obligation. But I think, and then there are also sort of initiatives that are happening, like the Tuvalu Australia Treaty, where Australia is obligated to take 280, I think, people from Tuvalu every year. But in return, Tuvalu has given up some of their sovereignty over security affairs, like given essentially Australia a veto power on certain security decisions that, for example, might implicate China. So yeah, I think it's a pretty fast evolving legal area, but I think the moral picture is separate to that. And for that, I would say the moral obligation is really to take climate migrants, but the international law is catching up.
I was wondering if the UUSC could set up or recommend a carbon offset program that could direct funds to your work.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know. I might give that question to Laura.
That is interesting. I feel like this is also above my pay grade. And I think that's a really interesting question that I can bring to our more senior leadership and to our board potentially, on if the carbon offset market is a place where we feel like we could leverage the power we have. As Mary was saying, we center so much our partners and their leadership on these issues. And I don't believe I've heard our partners ask us to do this, but it's possible it could be more on the interacting with our membership here in the United States if it's something that they would like to use to leverage for justice. A really interesting question. Thank you for bringing that up, and I'll have to get back to you on that one.
Thank you.
Any other questions here in person or online for our UUSC guests today? Yes, we have Nancy Ann here.
I'm kind of interested in the Louisiana problem because if the money given by HUD was due to the written problems and requests of the tribe, even though the tribe isn't federally recognized, which is a serious problem there,
Mm-hmm.
then when Louisiana ignored all of that reasoning for the money being issued, was there legal action taken? And if not, why not?
So that's a really great question. I think the problem about the federal recognition was that because they weren't federally recognized, the money couldn't go straight to them, and had to go through the Louisiana state government. However, there is some domestic litigation being undertaken, basically alleging discrimination, I think, as the video mentioned. So that's the way that they're challenging it. But yeah, the fact that they weren't federally recognized was a huge hurdle in being able to spend the money as that they would have liked to. Does that answer the question?
No. No, I understand the problem of not having federal recognition. I'm saying since the money was issued based on the stated problem and the requested change, then that forms the basis for the issuing of the money, regardless of who it's issued to. So was there legal action based on that argument?
I'll look into that for you. I'll see, but from my knowledge, it was just that there was legal action based on discrimination, which I think is a slightly separate issue, but not that the Louisiana state government failed to spend the money in the way that it was intended to be spent by the federal government, if that makes sense.
That's the issue. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I would, because the Louisiana state government had still said, oh, you know, we're spending this money on this many houses. It was kind of botched execution rather than spending the money on something completely different. But perhaps there would be an argument there, like depending on, I'd have to look into it a bit further. But maybe I can send that answer with Cassandra and Kate next week, who will be coming to present at the Sunday service next week. So there'll be another opportunity to discuss this.
Fantastic. Another opportunity in person. We've got another person coming up for
Yeah,
questions.
it's just a quick, thank you for supporting, Loss and Damage Youth Coalition. They were incredibly helpful to my prior UU church as we did Green Sanctuary 2030 planning. And they let us join their America's training as they, taught how to lift up the stories of those that are displaced or in danger of being displaced. And it's super professional for very young people. Um, I'll seriously take a look at the document that they've asked us to sign in preparation for the next COP. So that's just thank you for doing that.
This is a dog that churches.
The one that they put up on the last slide that is a statement from Loss and Damage Youth Coalition about compensation, and which has been a sticking point. And we need to take a look at the wording, or I do. But from what I know about it, or interacting with that group, most likely it's very professionally and well written, and something I can potentially support.
Fantastic. We'll make sure and get those slides out to everybody who's on the forum mailing list. And if you're not, congrats on getting here without the announcement. We'll make sure everyone gets that. Not seeing any. Oh, Laura.
I just wanted to throw in here that Ineza Imahosa Grace, who is one of the co-founders of the Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, was one of our guests at our table last season. But the interview with Ineza is still on our website. So if folks are interested in learning more about that, that's still available at uusc.org/guest.
Thank you. uusc.org/guest.
That's right.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Laura. Thank you, Mayuri. Any other questions before we close out our forum this morning? Kind of a truncated session with our technical difficulties, and we will be back here in 2 weeks for our next one. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much. This was really enjoyable, and yeah, I'm so glad that you'll have another opportunity to speak to USC next week. So yeah,
Me too. It was a great preview.
Thank you, everyone. It's good to see you, friends.
Thank
And
you
good luck
all.
this week.
Thanks so much. Yeah, go vote. If you have not already, go vote. Well, we have forum again in 2 weeks. Yes. Yes, but not this particular forum. Next Sunday service, there will be a presentation from UUSC. So that'll be at the 10:30 service. Not a forum. I'm good. All right, everyone. I'm going to turn off our laptop here and give this back to Michelle. Thank you for letting us use your laptop, Michelle.